My name is Lisa Tintori, and as I've been thinking about telling you my story, I've been considering that there's been two threads that have really run through my faith walk. And the first is that God has just been writing a love story with me my whole life. I'm 53 years old, and there's been this beautiful weaving of His love songs to me, His love story, His love reach out. And the second thing is that, unfortunately, the flip side of that is there's been a lot of pain and suffering and sort of the wilderness experiences and the things that keep you running to Him. So my life has been this kind of weaving together of those two things. So there's a lot of stories to tell. It's kind of an overwhelming thing to think about. How do I define myself? How do I say this is who I am? But it's important to say this is the context of not just who I am, but what the stories meant, what the experiences meant. So I just give that up front as an overview of what you might be hearing in these stories. I grew up in the church, and I was always aware that there's a God. I never had a problem with the concept of God, but it was a very traditional church. I was in every church choir, I was in the bell choir, I had the culture of church. But honestly, I don't think that I ever heard the gospel. I never heard the story of the cross as the redemptive story. And I don't know that that was anyone's fault but my own. I think I just never had the need for it, the awareness of it. I always thought Christmas was the big thing. Christmas was the grand adventure and not the Easter. And I do remember that shift in my experience where suddenly I realized what Easter was really about. Easter was the whole focal point, was the resurrection story of Christ. So my life was going along just as a beautiful little growing up thing. And when I was 11 years old, we had a crisis. I developed type 1 diabetes. My family and I were on a cross-country trip, and I got Rocky Mountain fever. And the doctors theorized that that was what triggered the diabetes to start. It's genetic, but it has to have some trigger that shows up. So this is type 1 diabetes where my pancreas just shut down. We had no clue what that meant. We didn't even know the word diabetes, and it wasn't until a neighbor told my mom, you know, you should really check her out. I started shrinking. I was just bones, really. Sitting on my dad's lap, he said, I could feel your bones. And I was 11 years old, shrinking down to nothing. And so the first day of 6th grade, they took me off to the hospital. So there were 2 points that were really traumatic. One was that I was thrown into the hospital to deal with this disease that we had no concept what it was, and to learn how to give myself injections of insulin and to learn how to do they didn't have home blood testing machines. You tested your urine in a test tube. I mean, it was horrible stuff back then. And the food science was all different. It meant you can't eat anything. It was just, you know, I remember the phrase in the little guidebooks was, you know, when you turn 100 years old, you can have a piece of birthday cake. That was the restrictions back then. The food science has definitely changed by now. But what it did was it traumatized us as a family. And also it was the first day of 6th grade. I missed all of the socialization that happens in the first 3 weeks of school. So it was a life-changing event at that point. But what it did for my mother was it caused her to recognize that there was something out of her control. So her very controlled experience of her life, and she was also in a church her whole life, church choirs, church directing, church education. She was an educator. And she actually ran to the Lord because of it. So it was the pivotal moment for her as well. So in her faith walk, she just came up with this wall where she couldn't save me, she couldn't fix me, she couldn't heal me, she couldn't make it all better, and she ended up on her knees before the Lord. Wonderful for her, but for my father and I, we saw my mother turn into a Jesus freak. And we had a problem with this. We were really, you know, what do we do? We had a very traditional kind of a church experience. And it was a good thing, but it was also something that, because I was preteen and I was in this traumatic experience of having to learn to take care of myself, I suddenly felt like my mother was off the deep end. And she started to take me everywhere because she was seeking the healing. She wanted this thing gone, right? So she took me to these wonderful full gospel businessmen breakfasts once a month on a Saturday. And they were Pentecostal, baby. They were doing everything, singing, and they were these crazy, wonderful people. And I was sitting in the back with my sort of very solid, you know, traditional background going, what are we in the middle of? So she's seeking the healing. She's bringing me up for prayer, and we have all these people singing in tongues and falling out, and these preachers and all this stuff. It was just something crazy, and I had to look at it like, okay, I don't know this whole Jesus stuff. I knew there was God the Father, but Jesus, okay, what are we going to do with him? And certainly the Holy Spirit was a whole other question.
Right.
So I do remember the first time that I saw a healing. It was at one of those breakfasts, and there was this little old lady who came up. She was totally bent over halfway, and somebody had changed her hem on her skirt so that she would have it even because she was so bent over. And I saw with my own eyes when they prayed for her, and there was no manipulation, nothing. It was just they prayed for her, and she shot up. Her back totally straightened up. And so much so that she covered her hem that now shot up. And it was, for a teenage girl, that was really traumatic. And I suddenly had to say, wait a minute, is this stuff for real?
Yeah.
And I'm kind of a slow processor in terms of I think things through and I research things. I was a very good student. So I started to really look at it and say, what do I think about these two things? What do I think about Jesus? Do I really believe all these things that they say about him? Is he really the Son of God? Is he really God? And I also started to look at the Bible. What do I believe about the Bible? And I must say with Glorious Redemption that it takes your whole life to answer what those two things are. But if you don't start there, you're not going to get the start. You're not going to actually go in. So I got to this place of saying, I don't know, I have to look at this. I have to really look at it for myself. It's not good enough that it's my mother's faith. It has to become mine. So somewhere along in here, and I don't remember exactly the age, I think I was 15, I got the flu for the first time as a diabetic. And logically, we thought, she's not eating, so she doesn't need insulin. Within 24 hours, I was 80% comatose. That's not the right answer. You actually need more insulin. So I remember that my father rushed me to the hospital in the middle of the night. And the doctor who I didn't like and who didn't understand teenage girls saved my life. So here I was being redeemed and having this chance at life again. It was Super Bowl Sunday, and my father wrote a thank you note to that doctor for 20 years after that on Super Bowl Sunday. We recognized that there was a redemptive act, there was an intervention. Now when I woke up in the hospital, I looked in the mirror and I didn't recognize myself. I saw the sunken eyes and the white pale face and the stringy hair, and I looked at this girl and I didn't know who she was. And then I looked at the chart on the bed where they wrote everything down, and it said out of control diabetic. And I thought, oh my God, they caught me, because I had been hiding that from everybody. They told me how to take care of myself, and I faked the numbers for the doctor, and I just said this, I'm going to write down this, because I didn't want to deal with it. I didn't want to deal with, this doctor who didn't understand a teenage girl. And so I suddenly was confronted with two things. One, I was given a second chance at life. I knew that I should be dead. And number two, I had to decide what kind of life. So at age 15, I took that chance to say, I want him to be my God, not just my mother's God. Now, I don't remember the exact moment of praying or going up. I'm sure that in some of those full gospel places, those are wonderful breakfasts, that I actually prayed the prayer. I'm sure of it. But I don't remember that as a moment. I remember it as a cumulative coming to that conclusion that I need him to be my God, not just my mother's God. And I started my faith walk as a teenager then. I do recall that I think it was by the time of my senior year of high school that God started answering prayers that my mother and I were praying together. And I thought that was amazing that he was a personal God. He wasn't just the God who shows up in the Bible, or the God who shows up in the miracle with the woman getting healed, or the God that I'm asking to heal my diabetes. That he was actually caring about the details of my life. So that was a fairly significant thing to discover. I went off to college, and I made the traditional mistake that people make when they go off to college. Thank you, Jesus, I got it, I'll take it from here. So it's been nice, and I'm nice and independent. I'm out from under the family now, and I'm just going to become this person. And I made my mistakes. I made all my mistakes in college, first 3 years. And college is that formative thing where you're discovering who you are, so that's part of what we do. But by the time I reached my senior year of college, I recognized I'd made all these mistakes, but I got so hungry for the Word of God. It was an amazing hunger, and I couldn't stop reading it, and I even started underlining, and I can point to the passages now Isaiah 40 is all completely underlined in red in the Bible that I still have. And I just couldn't get enough. It was an insatiable hunger in me. I started going to the Catholic service on campus because they had the coolest music. So they had the guitars and they had the cool songs, and I still to this day remember some of those songs. And because I was going, my 2 roommates came with me, so it was this event that we went to. Somewhere around in there, I heard that they were doing a Full Gospel Businessmen's Convention in the town where I was living. Like, wait, I know these people. Well, it was no longer your little Saturday morning breakfast. This was thousands of people in a big convention up in Rochester, New York. And I went, and I kept showing up next to the same people, which just doesn't happen in a big convention. This big preacher from Texas and then this wonderful little couple that just kept ending up next to me. And they finally looked at each other and said, I think we're supposed to do something with this girl. We keep showing up next to her. So they prayed with me and ministered to me. And it was the first time I had someone actually minister inner healing kind of stuff. All the mistakes I'd made, all the things, they read my mail. I didn't tell them anything, and they knew exactly what we were praying for. And it was the first time I saw somebody really hearing from the Lord. And this big preacher would be like, yeah, Lord, okay. And then he'd read my mail. Yeah, Lord, okay, all right, let's. And then he would pray a certain way and totally wash me in healing. So it was this beginning of understanding that God was intimately acquainted with my days. He was intimately acquainted and wanted it washed and wanted it healed and wanted it started again. So I don't remember exactly how old I was, 21, something like that. I count that moment as my recommitment to the Lord for the rest of my life. Now, it doesn't mean I didn't have to pay the consequences of the mistakes that I had made. So I went back into my life after the conference, and one of the things I did was I married my boyfriend, who was not a believer. This was a huge mistake. We knew it at the time, but I thought I saw God moving. I thought I saw that he was coming. I thought I saw, and there were all these signs that I could have pointed to. And God even gave me an out. He even gave me a way at the last minute to not marry him, and I didn't take it. So I entered that marriage knowing that I was independently making my own decision and going on, but trusting that when I threw myself off the cliff, that God was going to catch me. Well, I entered hell. You know, marriage that isn't based on the same ground is conflict from the beginning. And to cut to the chase of it, it took 3 years of learning how to pray for my husband before my husband came to the Lord, and he came to the Lord supernaturally. It wasn't his wife who convinced him to come to the Lord. It was Jesus who intervened in his life and showed him who he was and showed him that he was real. But in youth ministry, when I've ministered to so many people, I say, if you ever want to know who to go to for prayer, it's the wife of an unbeliever. That woman knows how to pray. And I know that from experience, that we know what it's like to be walking through something that's bigger than you. So those are my first 3 years of marriage. Very tumultuous, very difficult. At the same time, I was growing in ministry, if you want to call it that. I had a job I loved. I worked in a college. I had all these people I loved. I did ministry. I was at a church I loved. I had a house I loved. Everything was good. And after my husband came to the Lord, he had an opportunity to change jobs and to do something exciting and interesting in his life. And in order to do that, we had to move to a foreign country. And I actually went through this long process of praying it through and really knowing that, okay, I have things that I love, but here's his chance to have something that he loves, to feel like he can make a difference and to see God using him. So I said yes. It was a little bit hard. It was painful. We're talking about the country of Mexico, and I did not speak Spanish. I had taken 5 years of French, and I said, God, you could have clued me in, that I'm going to end up. The long and short of it is I got to do both French experiences and Spanish. But when I got to Mexico, I didn't speak a word. And it was an isolation experience because we were in a city that was out in the country, and he worked all the time. So for me, suddenly, I'd done the right thing. I'd followed my husband into this experience, and I suddenly was alone. And I had these great ideas. I was going to set up a darkroom, do photography. I was going to have all my time to write. I was going to have this creative experience. And I recognized I didn't know myself that well. I didn't do well in isolation. I thought I was going to be fine off on my own doing my creative, thing. And I started to have a really, I want to say mentally challenging and emotionally challenging. I really was in crisis. And I had 2 friends that were able to communicate with me. This is way back when, before computers were, we had a computer, but internet was not something you have like we do now. So for me, the computer kept crashing and the internet was not available. It's like, so you couldn't just pick up the phone and call somebody. It was very expensive, or then you had the internet. So, but I had 2 friends that kept my sanity for me. Suddenly back home, people started dying, and so I had my 2 grandmothers die, and I had somebody committed suicide, and somebody else, a long friend of the family, and all these things, and I couldn't get there. I couldn't be part of my community. I couldn't be part of my culture to grieve them, and I was in a real crisis. And I remember saying to God, I gave you my life. What did you do with it? Here I am. What did you do with it? And He started to show me that, well, you gave it to me. So I can do what I want with it. And I actually went through this process of despair, really, But I got to a point of actually saying, okay, and throwing up my hands. Okay, if you want me out here in the middle of nowhere, I thought it was, and whatever you're going to do, I gave up everything. And I'm a creative person, I gave up everything. And it was after that point that my husband looked at this whole situation and moved us into Mexico City. And it was literally like the demoniac sitting clothed in his right mind. It was that much of a shift where I suddenly found myself in culture. I was with, we found a church right away. I had a writing group. I had a quilting group. I had all these people that I was meeting from other countries. I suddenly was back into this community, which I discovered was very important to me. I didn't know that. I thought I was fine on my own. So I recognized that what was important about that was that I gave up. I surrendered. And so He gave me my life back. And it was a test. It was did you really mean to give me your life? Did you really want to give it to me? And I did. And so I felt like, whew, I passed the test. Now, when we moved into Mexico City, my husband at the time was saying, okay, I realized that God is not first in his life. So he recognized that he needed to put God first. And so we had a season where we were growing, and we were learning about our new culture, and we were, he was working a lot still, but it was, it seemed to me to be going on the incline up. And I have to stop and just say this is his story as well as mine. So I know I'm glossing over it, and that's not fair, but I see God giving me clues in it for myself. And the clue was that I had passed my test of, did you really give me your life, Lisa? And my husband was now put in his own test of, are you going to give me your life? And at that point, he said no, because 6 to 8 months later, he said he wanted a divorce. Well, we're in the middle of a foreign country, and I don't have a job, and I'm, I don't have a way to take care of myself, and he wanted to leave. The thing that had happened was that everybody noticed I took my camera everywhere on all these sort of day trips with people and getting to meet everybody. So people had already begun to ask me to take pictures of their family when they came down. So before I knew it, I was sort of becoming this freelance photographer. And I'm looking at it going, okay, well, I guess I could take care of myself. So it was the first time that I thought that maybe I could stay. I didn't have to leave just because he wanted me to leave. The long and short of it is that I ended up supernaturally staying, even though I was supposed to leave. And that was the calling. I knew I'd been called to be in that experience. We had an amazing church that we were part of there, and I was learning and growing, and it was a beautiful experience. But it was also quite painful because now I was on my own. Too many stories to tell about how God made that happen, but I ended up being on my own in the country of Mexico with my street Spanish. I had learned enough to get around, and well, the perks were that I was hired because I was a photographer who spoke English. That's why I was hired. So I had this experience with using my skills that I had, the one set of skills I could use, right? And then one day, as I'm in the kitchen, I'm leaning down to put the cat food on the floor, and my eyes filled with blood. And I immediately, I couldn't see. It was all foggy, cloudy, and I called one of my friends. It was, of course, a weekend, so you couldn't get the doctor. But they called the doctor, and they were able to say that, something's happening because of the diabetes, that you're experiencing the beginning stages of diabetic retinopathy. And most likely the stress that you've been under is what is causing this, because I was working my tail off to try to make this happen. So the long and short of that is I ended up having 11 laser surgeries for them to try to seal the retinal blood vessels. And then we discovered that, that wasn't doing it, that I was still going blind. So they, meanwhile, I'm trying to do this photography work, and I'm saying, God, you could take the legs, you could take the arms, but don't take the eyes. I need the eyes for the work, the only thing I can do to stay here. And I didn't know at this time, but my mother had been making plans to come down to help me, to take care of me. And she was the administrator for a Christian school up in New York. And she was working behind the scenes to make sure that she could have this time to come down. I was co-producing a version of West Side Story in our church at the time, so I was running around with one eye that was sort of fuzzy and one eye that I couldn't see out of, and trying to do this. And the night before my mom came, we had the final show, and apparently they gave me a standing ovation and I couldn't see it. And it was just this experience of, I'm still going to pour out into my life even though my body's failing me.
Wow.
And when my mother arrived the next day, she thought she was going to take me to the next laser surgery, and instead the doctor said, you need emergency surgery on both eyes now, or you're going to go blind.
Yeah.
So we didn't know. A friend of ours had recommended this particular surgeon, and so we went in there, and my mother said to him, why should I let you operate on my daughter? And he said, because she'll go blind. Why can't I put her on a plane and take her back to New York? Because she will go blind before she gets there. So it was that desperate.
Wow.
So here we are, that these two women who barely, my mother didn't speak Spanish either, but I could get around enough, but we showed up at the hospital. Well, actually what happened was that the night before the surgery was where I did my battle. That's where I was up all night praying and saying, God, are you going to take my eyes? Are you, what are you doing? And I wrestled all night long with that before I went into the surgery, so that by the time I actually got there the next morning, I was at peace.
Wow.
I was at peace because I said, I gave my life to you.
Jeez.
If you want me to be blind, or if you want to take my life, or if you want to in other ways cripple me or change this story, it's yours. I tell you, that's not easy. That's why it was an all-night wrestling with the angel, that kind of picture. But we went into the hospital, and I still remember waking up from that surgery with both eyes patched. And they don't do two eyes at once. They do one at a time so that you can still see.
Right.
But this was desperate. I remember waking up with both patches on, not knowing if I was blind. And I remember the nurse in the recovery area, and I remember waking up with a song on my lips, that I'm standing beneath your wings and I'm resting in your shelter, and your great faithfulness is my reward, and it makes me want to sing. And I'm singing in the recovery room in English. Well, we had a very long 6-week recovery period where I had to stay at an inclined position, and I couldn't move, and thank God my mother was there, and she didn't know. She had to be there. But in that period, she and I worked on our relationship. We didn't know we needed to do that. We didn't know we had healing that was necessary. So there were so many layers of what God was doing, but I also point to that and say, that was the turning point where I really, really, really gave him my life. I really gave up, and I really said, it's yours, whatever you want to do with it. 6 months, I think 6 months later, I was back on track with taking pictures again and just trying. I wasn't as strong, but I was able to get back to work, get back to doing it. And so I thought, okay, here I am. I'm going to get back on track, and I'm going to stay here. I'm going to live in this foreign country, and I'm going to make it work, and we're going to be going. And then I found out that legally, because of the documents and the papers, and my husband was leaving, I had to leave too. And I looked at the map and I said, okay, I've always wanted to go here. I've always wanted to go here. I can't go back to my old life, my job, whatever. And I said, no, I'm supposed to go live with my parents. last thing I wanted to do was, I forget, I think I was 33 years old at the time, go back and live with my parents. And if my mother and I had not had that 6 weeks together, that would not have been an option. But because we had had that healing, I knew I could pick up the phone and say, can I come home? And my dad had said, that's why I left the room empty for you. He was supposed to say, you know, all these other parameters, and he said, no, come on home. So I ended up moving home, and there was this amazing 3-4 week window of time where everything happened perfectly to get me and my cats and my furniture and everything out of the country and back to my parents' basement. Wow. And I remember when I arrived just saying to my parents, look, I'm sure I'm not going to know where I am for a while. I'm just a little disoriented. That was a traumatic experience, you know, but I came back knowing that I was supposed to be there with them. I still had more surgeries to do. We discovered, so I was actually in a better place to continue the treatments, you know. Right. So I still had 6 more months of blindness that came after that. We discovered that the surgeon that we accidentally had hooked up with in Mexico was the best surgeon, the best retinal surgeon, and he toured all their countries to give lectures. We just happened to find the best by the Lord's grace, right? Yeah. Same thing happened to me in New York. I found the best surgeon. Wow. Accidentally. Ended up in his office, and he took care of my next 4 surgeries that I had to have. And by surgeries, I don't want to freak anybody out, but we're talking knives. We're talking, you know, this is not just laser surgery. This is real stuff. So the long and short of that story is that even my doctors look at me and say, well, yeah, you're a classic case of a diabetic who should be blind. But you're not. I have some restrictions. I have limited night vision. I don't have peripheral stuff. I can't see this like everybody else can. Some depth of field is a little altered. I don't have the rods and cones. They were destroyed in the surgery. So you have like a cat's night vision. I don't have that. I'm absolutely no night vision. If I'm on a street with lights or it's a place I know, I can see, but it's just that it's restricted and I have to go there. And I almost look at that as a scar that the Lord uses to say, you should be blind, but you're not. You know, like, wow, I'm driving and I shouldn't be able to do this. This is just one of the ways that I know that pairing of how much He loves me is with, you know, what you go through, what you've experienced actually builds that ability. No matter what happens, He loves me. No matter what happens, my life is His. And so even though I can say, yeah, I have some restricted vision, I mean, thank God I have that story to remind me that I'm loved. And it doesn't matter. I don't have to take care of myself even though I can, or even though I have abilities. God is always going to take care of me. I have so many stories from that Mexican experience of how God supernaturally provided for me. One of my friends has said to me, you know, Lisa, you've had so many experiences of God rescuing you and showing up that you have no right to be scared. You have no right to doubt Him, and you have no right to be worried. She was seeing me worry about something financially. You don't have the right to do that. And I thought, she's absolutely right. I have seen His faithfulness over and over and over and over. So that gives me the courage to look at the next mountain, which, by the way, today I'm looking at mountains. I'm looking at financial stuff. I'm looking at problems, and I'm having to say, no, He loves me. And no, He's this good. I should be blind and I'm not. Every time we sing Amazing Grace, that's me. That is me. I was lost and I'm found. I was blind and now I see. Yeah. I can absolutely sing that as a personal testimony. We joke about coming home from and living with your parents, you know, but my parents were so gracious. They couldn't wait to have me home again, to have me safe, to have me out of that experience, and to have me where they could help take care of me. And I didn't know that I was going to need 10 more years with my dad. But instead, there I am living with him for 10 more years. And anybody who knew my father would just be jealous that I had that time with him because he was so phenomenally wonderful. And I got to have 10 more years with him. Years that I would never looked for. I would never, you know, in our organizing of our lives, we would say, oh, no, you're not supposed to go home and live with your parents. You're supposed to. I'm so grateful that I had that time. And again, with my mom, too, now we have this beautiful, beautiful relationship that if I had done my own life, that would have been on the outside. That wouldn't have been something I would go for. So I know that my ex-husband's life has also been in the Lord's hands because I've seen what God has done with it. When I did leave Mexico, We did have contact, and there was this divorce going through and all the proceedings, quite painful for both of us. But ultimately, he ended up marrying and having children and having this beautiful life, and we've been in touch, and I mean, we both know we're not going to go there, that's an old story, but I see the redemption. I see God taking him and giving him. He always wanted children, and now he's got 3 beautiful children. So I see the redemption in that, and I see that his faith walk came back. So my conclusion, this is me, is that God loves us so much that he will actually take things from us in order to get us. So he had lost his marriage, he had lost his finances, he had lost his health, he had all these things that God was gradually stripping from him in order to get to his heart. Now, we can turn that around and say for me too, God loved me enough, he took my health, he took my marriage, he took my finances, he took all the things that I was counting on. And instead, now I count on the Lord. So I can look at those things and we say, no, a marriage, yeah, I believe that a marriage is worth fighting for. But in this case, I can look back and say, God still had the upper hand by the end of the story. And then there was this wonderful conclusion for me. I mean, so many people in the church were looking like, okay, what's God going to do with my heart? And where's my, am I going to be alone the rest of my life? And I rolled my eyes at everybody who's chasing that, because I know that the only way that you get it is to lay it down.
Yeah.
And I've seen it and heard it over and over. So here I am, I'm back living with my parents, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah, I'd love to be with somebody again. But I knew there was a lot of healing that God was doing in me. Trusting was a big issue. And I jumped into ministry. One of the things that God did with me while I was blind was he plunked me down at the piano. And I had taken piano lessons for 8 years when I was growing up, and I always thought I was a mediocre musician because I could read the linear sheet music, but I wasn't very good at it. But I suddenly discovered that I was understanding chords for the first time in my life. And I remember getting so excited because there was nothing else I could do. I couldn't drive, I couldn't work, I couldn't really read that well, and all I could do was sit at the piano. And I literally felt like I was being instructed on how to do this. So suddenly music became this revised place in my life that it had died years ago. And then all of a sudden I started writing songs. I'm like, what do I do with that? I mean, I never had done that before in my life. And I ended up, through that adventure, doing ministry, doing worship leading, doing 2 CD productions, doing all this songwriting, this amazing adventure that I never would have planned. And it came from being blind. It's an astounding way to look at it, but without that stripping away of everything else, I would never have sat down at the piano again. I can't explain that. I can only say that God did that. God made sense out of that. So then when he asked me to lay that down again, okay, it's yours. So my life has been this series of, okay, I give you something and then give it back to me. Give it something, give it back to me. And I've really come to a place of trusting that if I don't do that, then it's just my work. It's just something that I'm doing. And I'm getting too frustrated with my own self, I would much rather give it to him and say, here, what do you want to do with this? I thought I had given up my hope and my heart to the Lord about being with someone, being with another husband. And I think that somewhere, I want to say a good maybe 8, 9 years ago, I suddenly found myself praying, okay, Lord, I just want to know if I'm supposed to keep holding on to this hope or not. Am I wasting your time and mine? I'm perfectly happy by myself. But if you have something for me, if you have someone who's coming, I just want to know, do I keep praying this or do I just give it up? At that very moment, the very next day, I got a letter from a friend who had written a letter 6 months ago with a word that the Lord had given her. And in the middle of this word was this line about, I'm sending a very special man. He's on his way. And it was all I needed to know. It's like, okay, I'm going to keep hoping. I'm going to keep hanging on. And it was done in such a way that I knew that the Lord was speaking, not this friend, and it was the timing of it. It's just beautiful how he does that. So the wonderful adventure that's coming was not one that I would have planned either. And probably I should have run the other direction from it, which is kind of neat when the Lord keeps us clueless. So one Sunday morning here in this church, the elder got up and he had his face bashed in, and he said, well, I met my neighbor this weekend, And he told the story of this man who beat him up and hit him, and there was this interaction over the accident over hitting a dog, and so the man got pulled away and is in jail, and it was this beginning of this intercession on a church-wide basis for this man. And he said, we've got to start praying for this man. And I didn't even hear his name. I didn't know who it was. I just started praying along with the rest of the church for this man who got dragged off into jail and who had been part of this altercation. And then he kept giving us updates. Okay, he's in jail, but I'm not going to press charges, and I've offered forgiveness. And but at the same time, then he got moved off to Ulster County, and he got put away. But we're still praying for him. So the whole church is praying for him. And following the story, and eventually we hear, oh, he's picked up the Bible in prison, and we're just sitting on the edge of our seats. What's happening? What's God doing? So one Sunday, we did hear when he had gotten out. So one Sunday, the elder brought this visitor, and I remember I was on the worship team at the time, and nobody's early to service. There's one man sitting in the back row. So I went up to say hello, and he was sitting down, so I didn't get the full impact of who he is. And I shook his hand. Hi, how you doing? Hi, my name's Marco. My name's Lisa, and that was it. I went back up on the platform. And then after the worship time, the elder brought him up, and there's this giant man, and they're hugging each other. Hi, I want you all to meet who you've been praying for.
Wow.
And I went, that's the ex-con. And that was the beginning of our friendship. We kept hearing this story of this man who was, just trying to come away from all the bad, all the dark, all the stuff he was still using at the time, which I didn't know. I'm clueless. I just didn't know. So he'd sit in the back of the church and he'd nod off, and I just thought he was tired. No, he was high. So we began this friendship, and after a while, I saw that God was doing something, and honestly, my mother will tell you, he had nothing on my list of what the qualities I was looking for. I'm like, yeah, me either. Yeah. And both Marco and I were not interested in each other. We were just like, he said, gimpy church girl, and I said, big, loud, strong, mad Italian guy, forget it, So we were just friends. The famous Sunday when I said to God, all right, God, you've got to show me that there's more here than meets the eye, or I'm not interested. And it was that very Sunday when Marco came up to me right at the edge of the platform. So he's way up here, and so, oh my God, he's right there you are. And he said, Lisa, with his hand, Lisa, I can't stand it. People say they know the Word of God and they read it and they don't live it. I don't even know it, and I want to live it. And I said, I am in so much trouble. So I started letting my guard down and letting this man into, a little bit closer. It was not easy, because he's a lunatic when he's out there. And he admits to this day that he would pick a fight just to make me go away so that he could go use. I had no clue. I mean, I was just so I'm trying to solve the fight. What were we arguing? Why is he doing? Yeah. So it was this very tumultuous period of coming together, getting to know each other. And I had a couple of friends who knew about this, were, very close, intimate sort of counselors and mentors with me. And one of them said to me, Lisa, I should be telling you to run the other direction, but I see God is doing something extraordinary here. And so, I've thought about this a lot. Like, we want to protect ourselves. And, most of my friends, if they had really known what was going on, would say, run, But I had a few key people who believed in what God was doing and were willing to support me and to pray for me. So many parts of that story that were like, I should have given up. One event was where we went to his brother's wedding, and by the end of it, he was on something, and I was the one to drive him home in the dark. So here I am driving up the road, and I had this complete peace. I knew the road. I was going to get him home, and he's thrashing really in the car because he's so out of it, and trying to convince me to let him drive because it's night. And I heard the Lord clearly, and the Lord said, stay steady. Stay steady. I'm like, that's all you got? Stay steady? I don't want to stay steady. And then the second part he said was, don't you give up on him. Don't you give up on him. And I said, okay. Well, we had made plans for him to sleep on my mother's couch, and then we were going to go to church a mile and a half away in the morning because he was going to get baptized. And he changed his plan. He's like, no, drive me to my truck and I'm going to go home. And he was this lunatic. And so I drove him to his truck and watched him drive out. I thought, I'm never going to see this man again. He's going to die on the road. There's nothing I can do about it. I went home and my mom was waiting up, and she and I prayed, and we just released it and said, God, protect him. And in the morning, I didn't know, was he going to show up to church or not? Well, sure enough, he showed up to church and got baptized the next morning.
Wow.
And I looked at that and I said, I guess that really was you, God. You really were serious about this man. There's something going on here. So I said, okay. I said, okay. And I gave you my life, and this is the story I'm in, okay.
Yeah.
By the time we got to, I mean, there's, again, so many miracles in the story itself, but at one point he texted me at 3:33 in the morning. Oh my God, call me. Well, you think somebody's died, he's on the side of the road, whatever. So I called him at 3:34, and he said, oh my God, God just told me I gotta marry you. I don't wanna marry you. And I said, great, I don't wanna marry you either. But if I should decide to obey God on this, there's just one thing you gotta do. And I'm thinking, what in the world is this man gonna come up with? You gotta do the finances. And I said, oh, please give me your checkbook. Please, let me do the finances. Now, I'm not a financial expert, but I'm like, I know how to balance a checkbook, and it was a wreck. So we got me on his business books, we got me on this, we started that. 3 weeks later, he crashed into the bridge on the Mohonk Mountain, and I mean, there's lots of parts of the story. I'm really, glossing over it. He tells the story. Obviously, he had tried to kill himself. He, we had talked about rehabs. He crashed into the bridge, and when we called the doctor at the VA, they said, "Why didn't you tell us you were looking for a rehab? We can get you into the Albany rehab tomorrow." And they sent a car to pick him up to take him for free. That's the VA for it. I mean, we were just astounded. Yeah. So, I've been doing all this legwork trying to, find this place. For, $30,000 is what the price tags were. I'm like, I don't have $30,000. But I said, Marco, if you need this, we'll figure it out. Yeah. And he said it was the first time anyone had valued him that much to think, we're going to do this. Somehow we'll find it a way. And meanwhile, the very next day, he's off to the VA. And that was his sober date. To this day, that's when he dropped everything, went through, and he calls it Jesus' rehab because he met the Lord up in the rehab. And because we had done the work to put me on the books, 3 of us ran his business while he was out of town for a month. I didn't know what I was doing, and he came back and he goes, you guys made money while I was out of town. How did you do that? All these miracles setting up. By this time, both he and I knew God was really doing something with us. So even though we were both still a little bit like, what's going on here? And do I really want to align myself with this man? I knew he was a solid Christian by this time. He had jumped in full feet with the Lord. Did I want to align myself up with a man who was coming off of all this history? 38 years in drugs. I mean, he has a lot to recover from. Yeah. But I saw the Lord working in it. And so a year later, we got married in this church with all of our friends beside us, and the Lord had actually told us 2 weeks prior, now it's time, get married. I'm like, are you kidding me? We pulled off a wedding in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And it was glorious. It was a celebration. I saw later that the Lord wanted me to be in position as his wife, to take the spiritual authority that I needed to take as his wife for what was coming next, which was at least 6 to 8 months of real darkness, real spiritual strategy that he needed his wife to be standing with him for. And I remember at the time the Lord saying to me, I know this is hard, but you're going to like the way he looks at the end of it. You're going to like the end result of it. And about a year later, I remembered that and I said, I do. I like the way he looks at the end of it. So the stuff that he's been through in that, since the 4.5 years of sobriety, has been this very intense college level spirituality 101, what does it mean to be a Christ follower? I see things happening with him that nobody else can do. He can speak to people nobody else can speak to. Yeah. He has such a story, such a way. He goes up to speak at this rehab center, and the guys are like, yeah. Whoa, if you can get clean and sober, I can get clean and sober. If you can follow Christ, I can follow Christ. It's amazing to walk through that. So my place in that, and even the stay steady is still in there, and the don't you give up on him is still in there. But now the Lord has shown me it's your job to keep him from giving up. You keep him from giving up. And as these tough times come, I mentioned mountains. Yeah, 38 years of drug abuse has some price tag on it, I'll tell you. And we're pulling out, the Lord is pulling us out of all of that stuff. It's taken a long time. And I have had to do some spiritual warfare, get on my knees in that house and say, this property belongs to the Lord. Right. We've dedicated his business, we've dedicated his life. We have amazing things that we've seen the Lord do. And so I have this sense of not even knowing where we're going, but I know it's good. I know the Lord's been redeeming. The joke in the family, including with our pastor, is that I had to be alone for 17 years after my divorce in order to be ready to marry Marco. So it's the truth. I had to be spiritually prepped for everything that I've been through. I had to go blind. I had to have all these other physical things go on with me in order to really be ready to step into this adventure. So, and I know there's other stories in there. Like I'm still praying to be healed of diabetes, and the whole church believes that's possible, and it could happen just like that. It's one of my things I still go to the Lord with. Lord, and we pray every day, Lord, stabilize the blood sugars, recreate in the pancreas the ability to make the insulin. There's so much that's beautiful in that walking out of a disease. So I still have this need for healing, but I've discovered what it's like to walk in need and to be successful. It could happen at any moment. Anytime I take communion, I'm like, it could happen right now. It could happen right now. I believe in that kind of God who loves me so much that he'll walk me through anything. He'll walk me through what I've walked through with Marco. He'll walk me through the blindness. He'll walk me through coming back to live in my parents' basement with nothing and to build me up to where I am today. So and to make a musician out of me. How did he do that? That's a miracle. I believe in the God who takes your life when you give it and makes something beautiful. And if you had done it on your own, you never would have picked it, and it would not be as beautiful. Marco and I both look at it and say, we both never would have picked each other, but it is so good that we did because we said yes to the Lord. It took him a long time to say yes, because I think he knew that, well, that it was going to be real. It was going to be something that I was going to continue to challenge him, and I was going to be, I mean, there's times where we definitely, we are so different. But we've both agreed this is the best thing that we did, was to say yes to the Lord's idea. So the question of who am I and how did I get there? Well, I know how I got here, and I know some of the questions the Lord's been doing, this beautiful love story that he's weaving with me, and this sort of challenge of, I know how to pray. I know how to stand in for my husband when he's under spiritual attack. I know how to stand for other people when they're praying for health and healing and wholeness. I've experienced healing through my hands as I pray for somebody else, and I've experienced healing as someone's prayed for me. I know the God that I serve. I know him. I can write songs like that. I can write songs about getting through a storm. I know that. So I believe that my story this far is preparing me for what's next. And that doesn't just mean for tomorrow. That means for the season, whatever that might be, that's coming up. And that's something that we need to keep that picture, that everything we've been through makes you not just a survivor or, somebody who can do this or do that or have skills, but it prepares you for how God's going to shape you into the next stage, the next season. I think that there's more people that are going to be looking at how Christians handle those challenges. And that's kind of why I think I've been through so much stuff, because people look at me and say, maybe I can do that too. Kind of like they look at Marco and say, if you can get clean and sober. If I can live with diabetes and be victorious and still pray and still believe and still heal through my prayers with other people, I don't do the healing, he does. Somehow he uses these hands, your hands, Marco's hands, to touch and bless. So as I figure out what the next right thing is, into today, into tomorrow, then we get into the next season. So that's my story. That's who I am. And I can't wait for what happens next.